Should the BBC be apologising to Robert Jenrick, or should Robert Jenrick be apologising to everyone else? It's not entirely clear, and I thought it might be interesting to try to sort of pick our way through this problem. Today's programme's thought for the day is supposed to be a reflective religious segment, not a political broadside, and Dr. Krish Kandia's reference to xenophobia was in BBC terms a breach of tone rather than a factual dispute. The broadcaster was not ruling on whether a remark by Robert Jenrick was correct, only that the vocabulary was too pointed for the slot. And the edit from the BBC Sounds confirms this. The concern was about contextual appropriateness, not the merit of the claim. The term Robert Jenrick talked about people from backward countries. Is that racism or is that condescension? And that question is, I think, unavoidable. It sounds racist. It applies a sweeping civilizational judgment to entire nations, almost always those in the global south, and ties that judgment to people's worth or safety. It positions us as advanced against them as primitive, the classical colonial vocabulary of hierarchy, but it might be framed as merely condescending, not racist. Jenrick could argue he meant socially or culturally regressive rather than racially inferior, and that he was speaking about specific attitudes towards women. The problem, he conflates criminality, presumed misogyny, and entire national origins. It's the same rhetorical shortcut used historically to stigmatise Irish, Jewish, and Caribbean migrants in Britain, and that would be racist. The assumption that the group's supposed cultural flaws are innate and portable. The problem also is that Jenrick has form. As the immigration minister, he famously ordered child-friendly murals to be removed from detention centres, arguing that they created the wrong tone, an act that many saw as symbolic cruelty. He's spoken about migrant hotels as if they were magnets for disorder, given sympathetic coverage to those protesting outside them, and linked small boats with a national security emergency despite their small share of net migration. In the Leeds Green Party language, this is dog whistle politics, signalling to anti-immigration sentiment without openly embracing overt racial slurs. Jenrick is still someone who's got his sights set on the Conservative leadership, and the Tory base is split between pro-business globalists and a nationalist anti-immigration right, and the leadership contest rewards inflammatory clarity over diplomatic nuance. The backward countries phrase therefore works as a shibboleth. The people who agree will nod, the people who don't were never going to vote for him anyway. It's the Farage playbook in a Savile Row suit. Calling his comment xenophobic isn't nitpicking. It's precisely xenophobia to judge people's suitability as neighbours passing that he's referencing, and that's based on origin, especially where origin is coupled to assumed criminality and cultural inferiority. But the nitpicking charge might apply to the BBC episode. Thought for the Day is not a political interview, so some might say this was just about the right the right tone in the wrong setting, but the underlying issue is that Jenrick's words are not neutral policy speech. They are loaded moral judgments about groups of people. And Jenrick's Sky News comments are going back even further about chanting Allahu Akbar deepen the pattern. The phrase is spiritually benign for most Muslims, Islamic hallelujah. And yet Jenrick framed it as grounds for immediate arrest. Even fellow Conservatives like Mel Stride and Baroness Wolsey said this was at best insensitive and at worst anti-Muslim incitement during a period of heightened sectarian violence. By doubling down rather than clarifying, Jenrick positioned himself as a candidate willing to provoke in order to signal toughness. And therefore, within that context, the backward countries phrase has a pedigree not only in British politics, but also in Jenrick contempt from imperial rhetoric, from Victorian imperial rhetoric to Enoch Powell's speeches. This sort of language always signals an anxiety about cultural dilution. Churchill himself used similar phrasing about certain colonies, framing British civilization as a fragile high culture under siege from the primitive. The problem is that history has shown such framing to be both intellectually lazy and socially destructive. So, the verdict: Has Jenrick been racist? Has he been condescending? Has he been xenophobic? Or a mixture of all of these? Racism? Yes, if racism includes cultural essentialism that targets groups based on origin and presumed values, the phrase in context fits. If is he condescending? Yes, in the sense of patronising whole populations as socially primitive without engagement or nuance. Is it nitpicking to say that he's not racist, that he's xenophobic, or that he's not xenophobic, he's imperialist? Well, not when words carry this much historical baggage. The BBC's action might be about editorial standards, but the public debate is about a familiar strain of anti-migrant rhetoric. And is Jenrick responsible for that? Is he guilty of that? Absolutely. When senior politicians casually describe entire nations as backward or treat religious phrases as inherently threatening, they legitimise suspicion and hostility that spills into street violence, as recent anti-Muslim riots in the UK has shown. This is not a side effect. It's the political fuel on which such rhetoric runs. We've got an appalling leader of the opposition at the moment. Jenrick would be worse. Bottom line. And, you know, I can think back a year and I was thinking, actually, Jenrick might be better than Kemi Badenoch. Absolutely not.